The second presentation has still to do with innovation, but is more focused on how to estimate preferences. So I mentioned in my previous presentation that one of the problems with innovation, and when we want to forecast them, is that we need to measure preferences, because preferences are important in at least in the substitution model. They are crucial in the substitution model, and we need to measure them. So this second presentation is more focused on that part. For that, I'm presenting some work using virtual reality, explain why, etc. So the first slide is like the diffusion of virtual reality. Virtual reality is an innovation, so it's not. And if you look at the forecast of how the virtual reality is going to be diffused among users, you recognize the shape that I showed before for electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles. So any innovation, the curve of the diffusion is similar. Again, because the theory is the same. Whatever is the innovation, it can be a smartphone, it can be a microwave, it can be a virtual reality, electric vehicle, etc. The theory of innovation, how they diffuse, has more or less the same shape. But it is true that virtual reality, it has been there for lots of time, but it became popular only recently. And now, people has a tom, they try. It's like become really, really much more popular, and they used a lot also in research. Not so much in transport, it has increased recently, but a lot in many other disciplines. I started using virtual reality in 2019. So actually, I was an early adopter of virtual reality. I was lucky. I got a very big project when I was working in the UK, and so I started my research with virtual reality. The reason why I decided to move toward virtual reality, and it's interesting enough that I never play a game in virtual reality. Lots of people I interviewed, they have tried play game, and I never, even now, after almost a decade using virtual reality, I never play a game. The reason why I decided to go in that direction is because I was interested as a researcher in measuring preferences. And because preferences need a real market, so what we have other ways. I will explain a little bit, but any other ways is not real. So I was find a way to measure this preference for innovation in a more realistic way. And this is why when I heard about virtual reality, I was like, wow, that's very cool, and I want to try using that method in research. So for those of you who are familiar with substitution model, discrete choice model, this is a simple example, but when I talk about preference, I mean this coefficient, okay? So the coefficient that tells you how important is each attribute in the choice, in the probability to choose a certain alternatives. So these models, this probability, are used to forecast the demand. If you use only substitution model, you use only this probability. If you use substitution and diffusion, you can use a theory like the one I discussed in my previous presentation, but you need to have this value, this preference. So how do we measure normally this preference in real work? Well, we have two methods. One is we ask people, and so we measure real preference, or we ask hypothetical questions, what we call state preference experiment, and we measure this preference in a hypothetical setting. So the problem with innovation, as I was saying before, is that there's not a real market. And for example, also for electric vehicles, now it's a little bit more mature. But initially, if you have only innovators, you can measure preference, but a preference for innovators, which are different from preferences for those who followers. So again, preference change. So we need, if we have a real market, we can try to measure the change over time, or even, how they are now. But if we don't have a real market, what do we do? So normally, we don't stop as a researcher. We have done for decades. We use, as I said, static preferences. Static preferences are hypothetical questions. We ask people, imagine you have to do something. If you were in this situation, what would you choose? And so they state basically the choice, and through the choice, we infer what is the preference, okay? So we measure the stated choice, what they state they would do, and then we measure the preference once we know their hypothetical choice. And these are hypothetical. So there is infinite literature about state choice experiments. They're great, but we know also there are limitations. And the major limitation is that this is not real. So people might be as honest as they can when they answer, but still is not real. So there is a gap, between what they said is important and what is actually, how much important it is when reality comes. And there are many different reasons why, of course, there is this difference. Many of the reasons are related to the hypothetical scenarios. But when it comes also to innovation, the problem I was mentioning before is that preference, we are not born with preferences. There's a big discussion in the literature between economists and psychologists, sociologists. Economists, they have always said we are born with preferences, and psychologists and sociologists are, no way, preference. We're not born with that. You need to try, you need to know the alternative in order to form your preference. And then the preference evolve over time. So, if you're in a stable environment, preference can be stable, but if you are in a changing environment, and innovation is a changing environment, your preference change with your knowledge, your experience, the experience of others, etc. So when you try to forecast demand for innovation, and other than the challenge I explained in the previous presentation, there is a huge challenge in trying to measure this preference because they don't exist. So here is like 4 examples of where we use a lot state choice. And you see it goes from measuring, for example, preferences or for new metro lines to flying vehicles. And now if you look in the literature, there are lots of papers on flying cars. And they use state choice experiments. That's the only things we can do. If you look at autonomous vehicle, again, they're not there, so we use state choice experiments to measure these preferences. But we have also used for, again, the introduction of new metro line. So when we talk about alternatives do not exist, it's not necessarily the same things as innovation. So innovation, if for a new metro line, for example, this is not an innovation. But if the metro is not there, for people it's something new. Something they have not seen, but is not a new alternative as such. So you still need to reshape your preferences, but it's not completely an innovation. So when we think about how realistic are the preferences that we measure with this method, compared to the degree of innovation of the alternative, they are indirectly related. So more innovative, less people know about that. The more, I would say, realistic are what we measure with this hypothetical instrument, because people have no idea. So the closer is to some alternative that people have somehow experience or they have experience, the more also using state choice is produce like more realistic value, because people, it's not an alternative I have with me, so I cannot measure your real preference, but it's still not completely innovative, and not completely different from what I have. So when we try to use this state choice experiment, and they use it a lot, so it's not a critic, but I'm aware, and that's why I also decided to use virtual reality, that we ask people to imagine a lot. Because remember, lots of people are not familiar with autonomous vehicle. So we ask them, imagine there is an autonomous vehicle. So, okay, yeah, maybe in the future. So, even if they're really, really committed, serious, etc., but still it's difficult. If think about yourself, if you have to ask this question, yes, you answer. It's not that you try to answer it at your best, but still, many things can be different when it comes to the moments where you have to really choose that. And this is why there is this discrepancy in the literature between what people said in the state choice and what people actually do in reality. Not because state choice is necessarily wrong, but because there's a natural differences in the two and what they measure. So this is where it comes the idea of virtual reality. So virtual reality is great way to, I mean, first of all, this slide is like there are different ways of virtual reality. So the best one is the immersive one, because we want people to feel living the experience. There are the other way, I mean, in general, we call extended reality everything that is a mixture between real environments and hypothetical one. The immersive one is the one with a headset where people really are immersed in the environment. So the virtual environment, I say, like, I thought when I saw the first time, and I still believe that, well, it's a fantastic opportunity because, if the problem is that people are not living the choice, with the virtual reality, we can put people in the environment, and so we can let people living the choice. And so I would like to measure, what is the impact, what is the difference between the preferences I can measure in a normal setting and the preferences I can measure if people can experience, living the moments where they have to make the choice. So, it's really, and then because of preferences, I measure like change over time. So with the virtual reality, you can also ask people to repeat several times and see whether, for example, preferences change as if they go through the experiment several times. So they get more knowledge about that. So the question is, how real is virtual reality? And that's not a trivial question. So we are all convinced that, yes, virtual reality is very real, realistic, etc. But how real it is? So here we need to, rely on work on other fields. Neuroscience, neuroscientists that look at how the brain works, and everything has to do with how our brain reconstructs the image that we see. Because we see the environment and then the brain elaborates that environment is real or not. So how the brain elaborates that. There are technical factors, of course. The more realistic is in the environment, the more the brain is able to elaborate an image and convince ourselves that we are really there. But at the moment, I could not found any literature also in neuroscience that says, these are what you have to measure. So even, if there are elements of realism in the way you build environment, but there's not something that you can objectively measure to say, well, this is perceived as realistic. And I find it was interesting that they also still rely on question, subjective. How do you perceive the environment? So they ask people, and we know that there is lots of subjectivities when you ask this question. They give an idea, but it's not like, especially engineer, we want to have some number, we measure, how precise is this number, etc. So that's not something that we can measure. And actually, when I started my experiment with virtual reality, I asked people, how did you feel? Did you feel the environment was real? And 90% of respondents said, yeah, I feel absolutely realistic. And then they had to make a choice in the environment. And then we asked, how was your choice similar to how did you feel? Was the choice as if you were making the choice in reality? 50% said, I felt that it was like making the choice in reality. So you see there is a difference between feeling the environment realistic. I feel I was there. When I make the choice, was my choice, my feeling as if I was making a choice in reality? It's like not exactly the same number. So there are studies still in neuroscience that they have tried, for example, measuring, the heartbeat or other measurement to see whether there was an overlap between a real experience and the virtual experience. So in a nutshell, without going into the detail of that, but what's happened is that if you measure simple emotion, like I'm scared or things like that, there is a good overlap. But when it comes to choice, because choice is not like, a simple emotion. Choice is a complex, task that involves emotion, but involves also reasoning. So when it comes to choices, there is not an overlap. So there was also some studies with fMRI, very simple one, because in the fMRI you have to be laid down and so you cannot ask people to. But when they were asking people to do some motion task, then there was an overlap. They measured an overlap in the brain activities between hypothetical and real movement. When they asked people to make a choice, there was not overlap. And choice is much more complex. And so, again, the same image I showed before in my previous slides. Choice are a combination of lots of activities, not only one. And there are lots of stimulus coming from everybody around us, our past, everything that happened, in our life somehow comes back when we make choice in a different strength, etc. But this plurality of effect is what makes choice much more difficult to measure. So we are probably not able to say when we want to elicit choice, how real is virtual reality? So the question I was trying to answer was more like, how different is first of all, is there a difference if I measure the preferences in a computer-based, online, or when people experience the choice? So that's the first question. The second could be whether are different, how different they are, which one is better. And that's, need external validity, again, is not that easy. So if we really want to compare what we measure with virtual reality with previous methods, so what are the previous methods? Depends on the type of behavior we are trying to measure. So virtual reality has been used a lot for continuous behavior, cycling, walking, distracted pedestrian, evacuation, wayfinding. So it's like all motions, okay? And normally, the standard method are video observation, etc. So I anticipate a slide I have after, they are completely different. So there's no comparison. You cannot compare what you get from the virtual reality to what you get with the standard method, because it's a completely different way of measuring things. Virtual reality has also been used to measure perception, and here some colleagues managed to have a measure of external validity. And perception is a little bit more simple effect than choice. So in that case, they managed to have an overlap, a comparison between real choices, real perception, and perception in the virtual reality. When you look at the choice as such, again, we use state choice, especially for something that is innovative. So I'm going fast here because I already mentioned that. So when we compare state choices with virtual reality, whether these are comparable or not depend on how the virtual reality is built. So there are lots of studies, for example, try to measure the residential location choice, okay? And then the state choice is about, you have an environment, a neighborhood with trees, or certain type of building, etc. And then you can describe in words. That's what we do normally in the state choice, or you can show image. So you can compare that, but the comparison is not perfect because the attribute is explained in completely different ways. So you have a mixture of effect. The way the attribute is measured, plus in the virtual reality, the presence. So what I try to do in this, try to measure is there a way I can only measure the effect of presence? So try to keep the same experiment, not change the experiment, not change the way people evaluate the alternative. Only measure the fact that in the virtual reality, they have stimulus around. They see how the autonomous vehicle, because the application was autonomous vehicle, work. So to do that, I built an experiment that I'm going to describe next. This is just an example for those who are not too familiar with the state choice experiment, that to show you what I'm talking about. So in the state choice experiment, we say, imagine, I make an example with autonomous taxi. So I was everything started because I started with electric vehicles, so I started getting enthusiastic about innovation, I mean the challenge that this brings in research. And then I moved to autonomous vehicle. And so when it comes to autonomous taxi, that is the most, and probably the fusion of autonomous vehicle is as taxi, share or not, but still not owned. So as I said, we use state choice. And so we ask people normally, imagine you have these two alternatives. You have to go from A to B, and then you have a normal taxi or with a driver. Everybody, is quite familiar with that. Or you have an autonomous taxi where you have no driver, but you still have a travel time, waiting time, price, etc. Which one would you choose? And then we change this number that you see there, and people state the choice based on this number several times. This is how state preferences work. We call state choice when the preference is a choice. Because the preference can also be I prefer A to B, but in real life we make a choice. It's not only that we stop with the preference. We say we prefer A to B, and we use A. So we observe people choose an alternative, so it's a choice. So what I was trying to do is okay, let's try to build an experiment in the virtual reality where people evaluate the same task as you see here that can be online, and the same task is repeated in a virtual reality experiment. And this way, if the state choice is the same, then I can compare the impact of being in a virtual reality from being sitting in front of a computer. So I can measure, disentangle, because otherwise you have so many effects that can play around, and it's very difficult to say this is due to virtual reality rather than something else. In this work, I have to thanks again another students of mine. I mean, of course, at this stage, the work is done by our PhD students, postdocs, etc. So Howie was a PhD student when I was in the UK, and now is postdoc with me and is still working on this virtual reality experiment. So this is the work we have done. This work was also a collaboration with a colleague in Canada, is Dr. Bilal Farouk. He's an expert on pedestrian crossing, etc., and was already quite advanced in using virtual reality. So we built this project together, and people did two types of experiment. They choose a taxi, and they also cross a road. The experiment was combined. So I'm not going to talk about the pedestrian because that's his area of expertise, so sorry about that. I'm only talking about the choice experiment that is my experiment, my area of expertise. The experiment was built both in Newcastle, in Toronto, and also not the virtual reality, but the online. We also run the experiment in China. So we have 3 countries. We have some paper also where we compare, cross-country comparison, and because we use the same exactly setting. So that was also an interesting result. This is an example of the environment we built. I don't know if you can distinguish, but there, this is a picture. And below, this is the virtual environment we built. So we tried to build visually the environment that was as realistic as possible. So we also pay attention to details because we didn't want the technical element of the virtual reality to impact any way into the experience of people. And this is probably why people said 90% said yes, it's realistic, because we really built the environment in that way. Of course, we had to modify a little bit the environment because at the moment there are taxi, even if the picture are not there, but only normal taxi, not automated taxi. So when you build some experiment like that, you need to think really carefully about what is your research question, what you want to do, because everything has to be built to control the impact. Okay, so it's not only that we have the real environment or realistic environment. Try carefully to think about everything that you can control, depending on what is your research question. So, for example, we had to redesign a little bit. So the environment was the same, but of course we had to redesign a little bit the road in order to accommodate the autonomous taxi. Because what we would like people to experience is to see how they operate. So I don't have a video here because, I mean, I could have shown, but I mean, when people are there in this virtual reality, the car moves. The avatar enter into the taxi. So there are a queue of people, that avatar, and they enter into the taxi. One line of taxi is with a driver, another line is without. So people see how easy it is to enter into the taxi, to move around, etc. So they see the taxi without, a driver coming along. They can, they have a kind of experience, even if they don't enter and they don't do the drive itself, but at least they see how it works at the moment they have to choose. So we would like to have, for them, the moment they make a choice, to be in front of this environment and see what's going on. So we have to think about this effect and build the environment in a way that, the experiment in a way that they can experience this environment. So imagine you are there. So and then the choice is with a ticket board, with a yes, a ticket board. So normally people make a choice in a smartphone, right? And that this is something we would like to do, but unfortunately with virtual reality, to have information about travel time and cost in a smartphone, it was too small to have a good definition at that time. Even now is a little bit challenging because the dimension, but at that time when at the beginning of the virtual reality, it was too much. So still it's realistic. I mean, there are lots of ticket boards. I mean, every time we buy a metro ticket, etc., we also use the ticket board. So it was quite realistic. So we built a ticket board. People are there. They need to take a taxi. And then when they touch the ticket board, it's a touch screen. They have the same, you see this, what appear. This is the choice. Say, well, you have for this trip you want to do, you have two options. A taxi that is autonomous and a taxi that is with driver. And this is, information about travel time, cost, etc. of the two. Which one would you choose? So the actual state choice is exactly the same. What is different is that they leave the environment around them. So they also can choose the destination. So to make it realistic, so which is the destination you want to have? There was a voice also. So touch screen, you have the written part, but you also have sometimes a voice that tells people select your destination. Based on the destination, the state choice was customized. Destination far away, travel time cost was customized based on the destination. Because again, it's very important that it's realistic. Is hypothetical, but it has to be realistic. That's the most important part of a state choice experiment. And then we ask them, how do you want to pay? So you have the full story of the choice task. Again, remember that in a normal state choice experiment, people go through several times. This is the benefit of state choice. We have multiple observations for the same people. So when you do this in the virtual reality, it looks a little bit too unrealistic, to make a choice of destination and then being there make several choices every time. So basically, we added a break in our state choice. We said okay, imagine now you have taken the taxi, you have reached the destination, you come again, it's a new day, you are here, so you have to go again somewhere else, choose again your destination. So we modify a little bit based on the virtual reality. So again, when you build the virtual reality, do not necessarily build an experiment exactly as you would build online, because it might not work perfectly. So think about that and eventually adjust both of them. That's my experience at least. Okay, so what we did, in order to measure the impact of the sense of presence in the virtual reality, we interview many participants. Actually, this is one of the largest sample I've seen in virtual reality, because it takes lots of time to get people into the lab, lots of hours and working, etc. So normally it's quite small, but if the sample is small, it's difficult to, get robust results and meaningful results. So we try to have a large sample. It was lots of work, and what we did was also, we used both between subjects, means that different people responded online, and a different group responded the virtual reality. But when you compare these results, there might be an impact due to the fact that people are different. And people might be different not only because socioeconomic characteristics, but also because attitude. And that's much more difficult to measure because, so we also try to have the same people trying both. So we have the same person, the same attitude, the same characteristic, and so we can compare. The downside of this is that your experience in the first state choice might impact how you answer the second one. So there is no one way that is the way perfect to do it. They both have pros and cons. So we try to use both methods. Different samples, so they are completely independent, their answer in the virtual reality and in the online, but also the same people answering. And we try to measure also the impact that having seen the experiment twice might have. So just to say that it's not easy. Even if we try our best to elicit, the differences, there are always some effect that might impact or confound, I would say, our result. But I mean, so I'm going to talk in particular about this within subject. So we had 208 respondents, and because each respondent went through the state choice 8 times, that's normal in state choice. So we have a quite large sample than we use to estimate our model. This paper I'm going to talk about is published in Transportation Research Part C, where you see all the description of how the experiment was built. So another recommendation for those who collect data, always try to run qualitative survey before. Even if we have lots of literature, every context is different. So it's always good to, go there and talk to people, and qualitative you can teach. They are very, very useful to go deep into some aspect. They are not for quantitative measure because normally they are small sample, but with small sample you can have a very interesting discussion and elicit some effect that otherwise would be difficult to measure. So it's always recommended go through all the steps before try to measure, with some quantitative measure with state choice experiment. So we try to do all this, and then in the state choice, we have first online, then some time passed, then they come back to the lab, and then they went through the same experiment, but with a virtual reality. I don't want to go through a question, also because I know not everybody is like an expert on discrete choice model, but just to say that both data could be estimated with a joint model, with a different type of data, and estimating a joint model allows us to measure the impact of the virtual reality into the choice that people make. So when we estimate the model jointly, you might estimate whether there are differences in the preference and difference also in the scale. And the scale means that is the difference in the actual choice. And normally the difference in scale, this lambda is the scale, is a reflection of the virtual reality that we are measuring. And also, we can measure if there is a difference depending on the order in which people participate in the experiment, whether they have seen first online and second virtual reality, or vice versa, first virtual reality and second online. And so in this way, we try to control all the elements that could impact the choice. But it's a normal mixed logic with multiple data sets. So, if you are familiar with this kind of joint estimation, basically is what we do. So after we estimate all these fancy nice models, what we found is actually that in our experiment, the scale, so the error associated to the choice was no different between virtual reality and online. Lots of papers who have tried this comparison, they found differences. And they say, well, the virtual reality is more realistic, so the choice is less biased, less heterogeneous, the choice. But again, most of the paper, the experiment in the virtual reality was not exactly the same. So if you describe an attribute instead of in the same way as online, visually, of course there is a difference, So you cannot say whether the difference is because they are living the experiment or because the attribute is measured in a different ways. And if you don't measure the attribute, the preference differently, this affects the scale. I don't know, maybe it's too technical, so I can, but I mean, the point is that the two experiments need to be comparable. Otherwise, it's difficult to say whether you are measuring only the experience they are having in the virtual environment, or if you're measuring something else. So the more elements change, the less is possible to disentangle what is the element that is causing the change. So the message, since you are PhD students, I would like to pass is like, be careful. Whatever experiments you build, be careful in building the experiment in a way that you can control the effect you want to measure. So that is, a good exercise, whatever is the experiment you are building. So in our case, because the state choice as such was absolutely the same, the only difference that in the virtual reality, they were seeing what's going on. So they had an idea of how the system operates. So because the state choice is the same, then we can say that the difference is due only to that feeling of presence, being present, being able to observe how the system works. So when we look at the willingness to pay or the level of services, how preferences for travel time and cost, we did not find any difference in how people evaluate the importance of travel time, the importance of cost. Online means like in a screen, or when they were in the virtual reality. And one reason for that could be that people did not try the vehicle as such. They only see the vehicle as they're moving around, but they did not enter into the vehicle. So travel time is something that is related to the experience within the vehicle, and people did not have that experience in our experiment. When we look at waiting time, again, they did not wait, but they could see people, waiting, queuing online. So it's something that in the virtual reality, they had some experience of what waiting time could be. And for waiting time, we found some differences as more important in the virtual reality than online. So again, they did not really wait that time, but the experience they have, what they could see was people waiting. The frequency of the taxi. So they had probably some hints of what waiting time could be. So again, be mindful of all the consequences that when you build this kind of experiment, your experiment can have. And these, of course, affect how you can evaluate your results. We also try to measure this famous social conformity, social influence impact, because I believe it's really, really important. So, I really was convinced when I read the first paper about social conformity. I said, gosh, you are so right. This is how people behave. But as I said, it's super difficult to measure in reality, to have a number. So we know it has an impact, but having a number and measuring it is super, super difficult. And so when we look at this attribute, even if they were exactly measuring the same way between the online and the virtual reality, but we found lots of differences. It seems that when people are in the virtual reality, the stimulus that they have from everything around them affect much more this kind of attributes that rely more on emotion or some feeling that we have. When we evaluate the time and cost, it's like a measure that it's a cognitive evaluation that you have. So it's not different whether you are in the virtual reality or sitting in front of a computer. But social conformity is more an experience. It's like not like a data, something that you can measure number. So we found that when we measure this in the virtual reality, things get a little bit crazy. That's much more heterogeneity among people, much more difference in how people evaluate that. So this is something that we are still working on because, I mean, I'm stubborn as a researcher, so I want to try to understand a little bit more what's going on there. But definitely, we found much more differences in the measure of this attribute that are not like economic attributes, okay? Just to put in this way. So, as I said, we can also use the virtual reality to make people learn. You know, we found people learn quite quickly. You know, they saw their car once, and that was, you know, that was enough. I mean, that's amazingly the knowledge they get about the work is much faster than what we expect. So we also repeated the experiments twice. So people did the choice, then they did the pedestrian, the crossing, and then repeat the choice. And we found no differences. So, you know, eventually they got used to the experiment immediately and was not significantly difference if they repeated the experiment twice. That was in virtual reality, so they repeated twice in the virtual reality. Something that we did not test yet in the virtual reality, at the moment only online, is again, we know framing is super important. So how we ask questions, even within the state choice, has an impact. So something that still for the social conformity, we tried, like, okay, what's happened if we ask the same question but in a different ways? So we tried 4 different manipulations of how we asked this question, and they were very small manipulation. In one case, we give them a message that was the objective was to kind of prime, so make people think about something. And then we just changed, like instead of a number, we put an image of number of people using it. Or we changed just the written. And then we had a large sample, almost 1,000 people, divided in 4 groups, and it was randomly assigned to 2 of these experiments. So they went through 2 of them, before and after. And so we have both within subject and between subjects, because each person answered twice, so we have a within subject. And then we have different people who try as a first experiment one of the 4 conditions. We found lots of, just to give you an idea of, for example, how we change it. We just had an image, you know, visually. And this one looks similar, but the written is slightly different there. And we found that it has a significant impact. So depending on how you present the attribute, this is not new. I mean, it's something that we know in literature. But again, sometimes we don't test it. You know, we have experience in doing the experiment, so we don't test. And I tested because I didn't get the result I was expecting with this attribute. So I said, like, gosh, I want to try something different. And it has an impact. What's interesting is also the reference point is important. I mean, again, we know from the literature. So if they see first the attribute with only statement, and then after they see the statement and the image, then, you know, they pay much more attention to that. You know, they capture their attention compared to the previous time. So again, we need to be mindful every time we build this experiment that we don't evaluate in isolation. I mean, unfortunately, and that's the beauty and the complexity of doing this type of research. That's okay, so conclusion, so late, sorry about that. So I mean, definitely, I will go fast on the conclusion. I think using virtual reality is great. It's really open up opportunities to explore in a more realistic way and expose people to to give them a more realistic experience, we need much more research. So everybody want to work and use virtual reality, please do it, because we need to collect research and results on how it works. I try to use a very big sample in different countries, but it's still my only research. So there might be that these results are in my context and not in others. So definitely we need collective wisdom, or experience to try to build knowledge in this area. So I'm continuing working on that and try different experience, experiment, manipulation, etc. And I'm convinced that this is the future of also our research, because it's really something that is also entering our life, everyday life. So people will be much more experience with the technology. So it's something that we could also use without asking people to come to the lab, which at the moment is quite complicated. But that now I don't want to leave you, take too much of your time, so I stop here. Thanks so much.